Welcome to Libeth. The disasters in the Hōjōki are not ornamental episodes inserted to create atmosphere. They are the foundation of the book's philosophy. Chōmei watched Kyoto burn in massive fires, witnessed famine reduce the population to starvation, saw political authority fail repeatedly, and experienced earthquakes that made even the ground itself appear unreliable. The central claim of the Hōjōki emerges from this accumulation of evidence. Instability is not an interruption of ordinary life. Instability is ordinary life. Before Chōmei could argue that impermanence is the foundational condition of existence, he had to prove it. And the proof he offers is not abstract. It is a sequence of 5 specific historical events, each one a different kind of destruction, collectively forming the most concentrated record of civilizational fragility in classical Japanese literature. The Hōjōki is often described as a philosophical text, and it is, but it earns the philosophy through documentation. Chōmei does not begin by asserting that the world is unstable. He begins by showing you what instability looks like when you are standing in the middle of it, counting bodies, watching buildings disappear, measuring the distance between the world as it was supposed to be and the world as it actually was. The Great Fire of 1177 is the first entry in the catalogue, and it establishes the pattern for everything that follows. The fire began in the southeast of the city and was carried by wind through the central districts, consuming noble mansions and commoner dwellings without distinction. By the time it burned out, somewhere between a third and half of Kyoto, including parts of the imperial palace complex, had been reduced to ash. Chōmei's description is precise in the way that eyewitness accounts are precise. He records the wind direction, the speed of the fire's movement, the specific areas consumed. But the precision is in service of a philosophical point that is made entirely through the factual account, rather than through explicit argument. The fire did not distinguish between the powerful and the powerless. The mansions of court nobles, built to embody the permanence and authority of the aristocratic order, burned alongside the houses of people who owned nothing. The wind does not read rank. The fire does not honor hierarchy. The social structure that the Heian world had constructed with such elaborate care, its ranked officialdom, its hereditary positions, its carefully maintained distinctions of status and ceremony, turned out to be a superstructure built over the same flammable wood as everything else. This is not merely a metaphor. The Heian capital was a wooden city, and wooden cities burn. But the fact that it burned is less important, philosophically, than the way it burned, indiscriminately, rapidly, and with a thoroughness that exposed how thin the layer of social order actually was over the physical reality of combustible material. The aristocratic world claimed to have organized the world. The fire demonstrated that the organization was administrative and ceremonial, not ontological. It held when nothing challenged it, and dissolved when something did. Chōmei understood this not as a critique of the aristocratic world specifically, but as evidence about the nature of all human organization. It is always provisional, always dependent on conditions that are themselves unstable, always more fragile than its formal structures suggest. The whirlwind of 1180 is described more briefly, but the detail Chōmei emphasizes is its arbitrariness. It touched down in a busy commercial district, destroyed buildings in a pattern that bore no relationship to the status or wealth of their occupants, and dissipated. No warning, no logic, no correspondence between what was destroyed and any category that the human world recognized as meaningful. Chomei notes the objects it carried: roof tiles, furniture, personal belongings lifted and flung through the air, the domestic order of people's lives made suddenly and violently external. There is something specifically disorienting about wind as a destructive force, because wind is invisible and directionless in a way that fire is not. Fire moves along the ground, follows the fuel, can be partially predicted. Wind arrives from above, touches where it touches, and the selection is incomprehensible. Chomei does not moralize this. He describes it. But the description carries the argument. The world is not organized according to any principle that human social structures can track or predict or defend against. The attempted capital relocation of 1180 is the most politically revealing entry in the catalogue, because it is the only disaster that was produced by human decision rather than natural event. The government, under pressure from the outbreak of the Chomei War and the breakdown of the political order that the war represented, decided to move the capital from Kyoto to a site in what is now the Kobe area, associated with the Terra clan's power base. The decision was made hastily, implemented chaotically, and reversed within months. But the chaos of the interim period produced its own kind of destruction. People abandoned their homes in Kyoto. New construction began at the new site before the old city had been properly wound down. Noble families dismantled parts of their Kyoto mansions to transport the materials. The roads were clogged with people and goods moving in both directions at once. Chomei describes the abandoned buildings, the half-finished structures, the city that was neither fully itself nor fully not itself during the months of transition. And then the reversal, the government's decision to return to Kyoto, left everything in a state of partial damage, the old capital degraded and the new one abandoned. The significance of this episode is different from the others in the catalogue. The fire and the earthquake were things that happened to the city from outside. The capital move was something the governing class did to the city from inside, in an attempt to manage a political crisis, and it produced a disaster that was arguably more disorienting than the natural ones because it was voluntary. The ruling class, the people whose function was to maintain the stability of the social order, turned out to be capable of generating instability on a considerable scale when they acted in panic rather than with coordination. The episode reveals the administrative fragility of the Heian system. A government that could not maintain the political control necessary to resist a military challenger was also a government that could not coordinate a capital relocation without creating chaos. The formal structures of governance were present. The actual capacity to govern effectively was not. The famine of 1181 and 1182 is the longest and most carefully constructed section of the disaster catalogue, and it is the most human. Fire and earthquake destroy things. Famine destroys people, slowly, systematically, in a way that forces Chomei to look at individuals rather than buildings. He cannot describe the famine through architecture. He has to describe it through bodies. The famine was caused by 2 consecutive years of failed harvests, drought, crop failure, the disruption of the agricultural supply chains that fed the capital. It unfolded against the background of the Chomei War, which had disrupted the provinces that supplied Kyoto and made it impossible for the government to organize relief distribution, even if it had possessed the will and the administrative capacity to do so, which it did not. The capital starved not because there was no food in Japan, but because the political fragmentation that the war represented had also fragmented the economic infrastructure. The Shun system, the network of private estates whose tribute flows fed the capital, depended on a degree of political stability that the war had eliminated. When the provinces were battlefields, the tribute did not move. When the tribute did not move, the capital had nothing. Chomei counts bodies. He records specific numbers, tens of thousands dead in a limited area over a period of months. He notes the season in which specific districts were worst affected. He records the gradual breakdown of the social responses to death. The funerals that could not be conducted because there were too many dead, the bodies left in streets because there was no one to move them, the living who stepped over the dead on their way to look for food that was not there. He describes specific individuals. An old man and a small child found dead together, the old man's body used as a pillow. He describes the methods that people used to stay alive. Eating things that were not food, selling possessions, eventually abandoning their children or their aged parents because feeding them had become impossible. The Buddhist clergy marked foreheads of the dead with the character A, the first letter of the Sanskrit alphabet, a ritual of passage, until the numbers made even that gesture impossible to sustain. What Chomei is doing in this section is not sentimental. He is not performing grief. He is documenting, with the same precision he brought to the fire and the earthquake, what happens to human beings when the social and economic structures that sustain them fail. The famine dead are not casualties of a natural disaster in the simple sense. They are casualties of the intersection of a drought, which was natural, with a political system that could not respond to it, an economic infrastructure that could not sustain it, and a military conflict that had consumed the institutional capacity that might have mitigated it. The deaths are the visible result of the accumulated fragility of the entire system, made sudden and physical by a failure of the harvest. Chomei's precision in documenting them is itself a form of argument. This is what it costs. This is the human price of a world organized around structures that cannot hold. The earthquake of 1185 ends the catalogue and is in some ways the most philosophically significant event in it, not because of the scale of damage, though the damage was substantial, but because of what the earthquake attacks. Fire destroys what is above the ground. Famine destroys the human body from within. Earthquake destroys the ground itself. Chomei describes the initial shock, the collapse of buildings, the dust that obscured the city, and then the aftershocks, continuing for days and weeks, each one a reminder that the stability that had returned was provisional, that the ground had not finished moving, that the assumption of a stable surface on which human life could be constructed was an assumption that the earth had just demonstrated it was not obligated to honor. The ground is the most basic of the things we take for granted. We build on it. We walk on it. The entire constructed world, houses, roads, cities, depends on its stability. When it moves, the shock is not only physical but cognitive. The category of reliable things, already shrunk by the fire and the famine, loses one more member. If the ground is not stable, then what is? Chomei does not draw this conclusion explicitly. He describes what he saw and what he felt, and the conclusion is available to the reader who has followed the 5 disasters as a sequence, rather than as isolated events. Taken together, the 5 disasters constitute an empirical argument for the river image that opens the text. This is what the ceaseless flow looks like in practice. This is what it means that the water is never the same. The foam forms, the city is built, the society is organized, the hierarchy is established, and it dissolves. The fire, the wind, the government's own panic, the famine, the earthquake. Each is a different mechanism of dissolution, a different way in which the apparent permanence of the human world reveals itself as an appearance. And Chomei witnessed all of them. The philosophy that follows the catalogue is not a philosophy adopted from a text or derived from a tradition in the abstract. It is a philosophy that the world forced on him through the accumulated evidence of his own eyes. This is what makes the Hojoki something other than Buddhist didacticism. The impermanence it teaches is not a doctrine. It is a fact, documented, specific, and brutal enough to be undeniable. The withdrawal to the 10-foot hut does not follow from the philosophy. The philosophy follows from the world. And the world for Chomei was 5 disasters in 40 years, a blocked career, a collapsing political order, and the knowledge that all of it, the fires, the famine, the bodies in the street, the earthquake's aftermath, was not an interruption of the normal order but a revelation of it. What makes the Hojoki remarkable as disaster literature is its refusal to romanticize suffering, while also refusing to treat catastrophe as meaningless accident. Chomei records destruction with almost documentary precision because he wants the reader to see impermanence not as abstraction, but as physical fact. The disasters reveal the fragility of houses, governments, social ranks, economies, and even collective identity itself. Once that fragility becomes undeniable, the philosophical question changes. The problem is no longer how to secure permanence, but how to live honestly without it. That shift is the true center of the book. The hut matters only because the disasters came first. That's all for today on Libeth. One new book every week. At least we try.